Okay, Will and Evelyn never learned what it was that caused a wave of uncertainty in the Wargles who surrounded this small group. In fact, it happened at the moment when Morgoth realized he had been tricked into exposing his army to Duncan's cavalry. The sudden vision of fear that ran through his mind communicated itself instantly to all of his mind slaves. The two captives and the 4 Canadians all noticed a sudden uneasiness, and hesitantly in the 20 or so Wargles warriors who had been left to guard them, Eric glanced quickly at his men, sensing an opportunity. So far they had not been disarmed. The odds of 4 against 20 were too much net even for Canadians, and the Wargles had only been told to detain them, not disarm them. Something's happening, the Canadians' general muttered. Stay ready, everybody. Unobtrusively, the small party made sure their weapons were free and ready for action. Then the moment of uncertainty turned to real. Palpable fear among the Wargles. Morgoth had just signalled a general retreat, and those at the rear didn't distinguish themselves from the front-line troops for whom the orders were intended. Over half of the Wargles guarding them simply ran. One sergeant, however, retained a vestige of independent thought, and he growled a warning to his section, 8 in total, as their companions struggled and fought to make their way into the jam-packed entrance to 3 steps past. The remaining 8 black-clad troops held their position, but they were distracted and nervous, and Eric decided that the opportunity wouldn't get any better than this. "Now, lads," he yelled, and swept his broad double-headed axe in a low horizontal arc at the sergeant. The Wargle tried to bring his iron spear up in defense, but he was a fraction too slow. The heavy axe sheared through his armor, and he was down. As Eric sought another opportunity, his men fell on the rest of the Wargle troops. They chose the moment when another mind command went out from Morgoth for his men to withdraw and form a defensive position. The confusing orders in their minds made them easy targets for the Canadians, and they fell in short orders. The others around them, instead intent on escaping to 3 steps past, took no notice of their brief and bloody skirmish. Eric looked around him and with some satisfaction, wiping his sax blade clean on a cloth he had taken from one of the dead Wargles. "That's better," he said heartily. "I've been wanting to do that for days." Oh, that's nice, isn't it? But the Wargles hadn't left their group unscathed. As he spoke, Norlid staggered and sank slowly to one knee. Bright blood stained the corner of his mouth, and he looked helplessly at his leader. Eric moved to his side and dropped to his knees. "Norlid," he cried, where are you wounded?" But Norlid could barely talk. He was gasping his right side, where the sheepskin vest was already heavily saturated with his stain. The heavy sword he favored as a weapon had fallen from his grip. His eyes wide with fear, he tried to reach it, but it was beyond his grasp. Quickly, Hark scooped up the weapon and put it in his hands. Norlid nodded his thanks and slowly let himself drop to a sitting position. The fear was gone from his eyes now. Will knew that Canadian believed a man must die with his weapon in hand if his soul were not to wander in torment for eternity. Now that he had his sword firmly in his grasp, Norlid was not afraid to die. Weakly he waved them away. "Go," he said finally, finding his voice. "I'm finished. Get to the ships." Eric nodded quickly. "He's right," he said, straightening up from beside his friend. "There's nothing we can do for him." The others nodded, and Eric grabbed first Will and then Evelyn and shoved them along in front of him. "Come on, you two," he said roughly, "unless you want to stay here till Morgoth gets back." And moving together in a tight little group, the 5 of them shoved their way through the milling crowd of Wargles, all trying to move in the opposite direction. Morgoth was stung by the impact of the heavy leather glove on his face. Furious, he turned to stare at the challenger who had ruined his plan. Then he allowed thin smile to spread over his face once more. His challenger was no more than a boy, he realized, big, certainly, and muscular, but the fresh face under the simple conical helmet couldn't have been more than 16 years old. Before the start till members of the King's Council could react, he replied swiftly, "I accept the challenge." He was a second ahead of Duncan's furious cry, "No, I forbid it." Realizing he was too late, he appealed to Morcarth. "For pity's sake, Morcarth, he's only a boy, as you can see, an apprentice. You can't accept his challenge." "On the contrary," Morcarth replied, "as I've just pointed out, I have that right. And as you know, once a challenge is given and accepted, there can be no withdrawal." He was right, of course. The strict rules of chivalry and knighthood, by which they had all sworn solemn oaths to be bound, did decree just that. Morga smiled now at the boy beside him. He would make short work of him, and the boy's quick death would serve to infuriate Holt even more. Holt, meanwhile, watched the Lord of Rain and Night through stilled eyes. "Morgarth, you're already a dead man," he muttered. Holt felt a firm hand on his arm, and he turned to look into Sir David's grim eyes. The battlemaster had his sword drawn and resting over his right shoulder. "The boy will have to take his chances, Holt," he said. "His chances? He has no chance," Holt replied. Sir David acknowledged the fact sadly. "Be that as it may, you can't interfere in this combat. I'll stop you if I even think you're going to try. Don't make me do that. We've become friends far too long. We've been friends for far too long." He held Holt's angry gaze for a few seconds, then the ranger agreed bitterly. He knew the knight wasn't bluffing. The codes of chivalry meant everything to him. The byplay hadn't been lost on Morgarth. He was confident that the moment the boy fell, Holt would accept his original challenge, King's orders or not, King's orders or no King's orders, and then, at least, Morgarth would know the satisfaction of killing his old, hated enemy before his own world came crashing down around him. He turned now to Horace. "What weapons, boy?" he said in an insulting tone. "How do you choose to fight?" Horace's face was white and stained with fear. For a moment his voice was trapped inside his throat. He wasn't sure what had come over him when he had galloped forward and issued his challenge. It certainly wasn't something he planned. A red rage had seemed to overtake him, and he had found himself out here in front of the entire army, throwing his gauntlet into Morgarth's startled face. Then he thought of Morgarth's threat to Will, and how he had been forced to leave his friend at the bridge, and he managed at last to speak. "As we are," he said. Both of them carried swords up. In addition, Morgarth's long kite-shaped shield hung at his saddle, and Horace carried his round buckler slung on his back. But Morgarth's sword was a two-handed broadsword, nearly a foot longer than the standard cavalry sword Horace carried. Morgarth's turn now to call once more for Duncan. "The whelp chose to fight as we are. You'll stand by the rules of conduct, I assume, Duncan," he said. "You'll fight not unmolested," Duncan agreed in a bitter tone. "Those were the rules of single combat." Morgarth nodded and made a mocking bow in the king's direction. "Just be sure that murderous Ranger Holt understands that," he said, continuing his plan of driving Holt to a cold fury. "I know he has little knowledge of the rules of knighthood and chivalry." "Morgarth," said Duncan coldly, "don't try to pretend that what you're doing has any connivance with real chivalry. I ask you once more times, spare the boy's life." Morgarth feigned a surprised expression. "Spare him, your majesty? He's a lump of a boy, big for his age. Who knows, you might be better served asking him to spare me." "If you must persist with murder, that's your choice, Morgarth, but save us your sarcasm," said Duncan. Again Morgarth made that mocking bow. Then he said casually over his shoulder to Horace, "Are you ready, boy?" Horace swallowed once, then nodded. "Yes," he said. It was Gillen who saw what was coming and managed to shout a warning just in time. The huge broadsword had snaken out of his scabbard with incredible speed, and Mordecai swung it backhanded at the boy beside him. Warned by the shout, Horace rolled to one side, the blade hissing centimeters above his head. In the same movement, Morgoth had set spurs to his dead white's horse and was galloping away, racing for his shield and settling it on his left arm. His mocking laughter carried back to Horace as the boy recovered. Then let's get started, he laughed, and Horace felt his throat go dry as he realized he was now fighting for his life. Oh, well, that was a nice little build-up. We haven't even started fighting yet. Okay, well, if you don't want to listen to me read chapter 35, then please stay tuned, and I will see you next time. Thank you, bye-bye.